What's up, guys? It's Johnny Candido of Candido Training HQ. Today's video is on how to coach yourself part 2. Now, part 1 is linked in the description. It's a very in-depth video, in my opinion, the most in-depth on the internet on that topic. And this will very naturally extend off of that and go even deeper. So similar to that video, I want to start off by saying, please share this video with anybody who would benefit from it. Anybody who's looking to coach themselves for powerlifting, which ultimately is still the majority. You know, most people are not paying, $150, $250, $300 a month for coaching. Now, that being said, if all of this does confuse you, then link is in the description to my paid programming service, which is basically programming forever and is a full timeline. So just in case you get confused and you go, Johnny, I don't want to do this on my own, there's your solution as well for some specifics. And that's only $24.99 a month. So for this video specifically, what I'm going to talk about is progressions within a given training cycle or block. Whereas part 1 was more across training cycles. Also, I had a bunch of resources which will be useful here as far as anatomy, and then also some studies which will also extend off of that. And I'll give you a few more. And one big thing is, probably the biggest thing is I'm going to have very specific points where I give opinions on what I would do differently on certain programs. And that's one thing I really want to kind of cut through the kind of normie advice where people just say kind of the same broad concepts. And I want to give you specifically, like, what do I actually think? How long should a training cycle be with a particular style, and which slots should have which type of progression? Because all of those have very specific opinions. I wouldn't say definitive answers, but I think you'll really get a lot of clarity on exactly how to apply this all, not just this broad explanation of like, what is linear periodization? What is block periodization? I don't want to do that in this video at all. So that being said, we will have to understand the concepts. So first of all, the broad question that I've been asked that kind of spurred on this is, what style of progression do you typically program? Is it static RPE or accumulating and rising RPE within a given training block? Now, I'll also add a third style, which is changing reps and sets. However, I won't just say it's linear periodization, because linear periodization is by definition increasing intensity as you're decreasing volume over time. Now, believe it or not, I have seen programs by science-based YouTubers that are completely just linear periodization, where it's like a 12-week period and the highest volume is the first 4 weeks and then just goes down like very linearly from there. And yeah, that's not a style where you're going to peak effectively. However, there are circumstances where changing reps or changing sets in a creative way while doing some interesting things as far as manipulating volume can be effective. So I'm going to call this third category linear periodization with seasoning.
I think we might have found the seasoning we've been looking for.
So as we begin, I think we can simplify a lot of this in just 2 priorities that fight against each other. On one hand, you have a similarity of stimulus, and on the other hand, you have a direction of the training cycle or block. So those compete with each other because obviously you have total similarity, then you may have less direction. If you have a bunch of direction, you might have some crazy type of stimulus, like obviously doing like a 15 rep set and then a single at the end of a 4-week block technically has the most direction, but it's absurd, right? So with that being said, let's get into these styles with that in mind, of that balance, because there's actually going to be really interesting times where it won't be as obvious as you would think as far as what actually is a more similar stimulus, which we'll get to. And it really comes down to some mechanistic reasons, and certain studies can start to be relevant. So first is static RPE progressions. Now, obviously, the biggest upside with static RPE is the fact that you're keeping everything so similar, they're able to then just react to how you're doing. And it's no coincidence that this was popularized by reactive training systems. Mike Teixeira specifically, gets really the majority of the credit as far as really leading the charge on this style of training. Now, some of the advantages are quite significant and worth really emphasizing here is that, first of all, you can react to when you're the strongest, and instead of predetermining your cycle duration, you just run a program all the way through. Let's say you're hitting RP 8 singles the whole way through, and you find out on week 6 you're the strongest. Well, then you can say, okay, well, now I'm going to do 6-week cycles on my squat, and then maybe on your bench press, you're the strongest on week 4, and then you do 4-week phases on your bench and 6-week on your squat. That is absolutely a really big upside that you're not going to quite get with the other 2 styles, at least as effectively. So that is a big point, and it's one where, ultimately the biggest advantage is that you're able to isolate variables more effectively here. Because you're not changing anything else, you're able to see like, okay, should I remove an accessory? Then let's see what happens. Should I add something? Then you see what happens in a very consistent environment. Really controlled. However, there are some really big downsides to this style of training. Now, probably the single biggest reason why I don't typically recommend this for the majority of slots, certainly not the majority of primary slots for most people, is because it's, especially if you're coaching yourself, it's very difficult to actually have the maturity, the reflection, to look at this, do this effectively, make the right decision, and then also reflect accurately on what you just saw. If you're hitting an RP8 single for, let's even say 4 straight weeks, what happens if week 3 you actually are weaker? Are you actually going to use less weight? Are you actually going to do that? I would not prefer doing static RP really on the basis of that. First and foremost is that it is a challenge mentally to be that mature sometimes. Now it depends on the person, but most importantly, again, we're bringing it back to coaching yourself. This is a process that you would really benefit from a coach. And that part is the most critical to this video. Is I think there's very few people who are going to want to do this style and succeed more from doing this style because it requires so much across week analysis, not in terms of complexity, but in terms of honesty and getting a second set of eyes and seeing like, okay, why'd your squat move a little bit worse this week than next week, and making the mature decision across weeks continually. And ultimately, for some people, it's just boring. And that's another big factor.
This is boring.
So I'm going to get to the points where I would recommend using this style the most, because actually almost no matter what the periodization style you use, I think there should at least be a handful of slots that are completely static. I think most people intuitively know that because, for example, on leg extensions, not everyone's going to always have the most complex periodization for single joint movements, nor should they. So where I do recommend it is on something like leg extensions for 3 sets of 12 at RP7 on the last set with low hype. That's a great example of something where you can do that at the end of your primary squat day consistently. And even if your squat's fluctuating, just have that rolling steady. Now, I think that's pretty intuitively obvious, but I do think that there's another slot that's not as obvious where I actually wouldn't always program static RP. And that's something like a hack squat or a plat squat or a leg press. I've seen a lot of powerlifting coaches complain that a lot of people undershoot their accessories as far as heavy accessories like a hack squat. The reality is, if you're programming 3 sets of 8 at RP8 on each individual set, every single week, in addition to competition squats and competition deadlifts, all of these more important movements to the lifter, for powerlifting purposes, odds are they're not going to hit 3 sets of 8 at a true RP8 because that's incredibly hard to consistently do with really all your might. And that's one thing that can become a problem in terms of programming, is like maybe you have to accept the responsibility on the program. So in situations like that, for example, plat squat especially, that's where I like to start off with maybe RP 6.5 top set and then percentage drops, but really small percentage drops. So not like a competition lift where you can take a bigger percentage drop. Let's just say like 2.5% or 3% drops. So you hit RP 6.5 top set of like 11 reps and then just drop 3%, like that. And then you go from RP 6.5 to RP 7 to maybe RP 7.5, and then finally like a really hard set at RP 8 at the end. So that's a great example of that's building momentum on a heavier lift in a way that's very sustainable and that's exciting. And then ultimately over time, you can just aim to add, 15, 30 pounds onto your leg press or plat squat or hack squat, and then just straight up do it that way and not overthink RPE. That can be very effective because ultimately that type of machine movement, yes, it's for muscular development, but it's also a little bit more complex than that because that's also a movement pattern with enough force to have some meaningful transference beyond simple quad activation. Where something like a leg extension, that's where it's just pure activation, obviously. And then it becomes a matter of, okay, let's keep that static, and then let's just make a decision on what's best for fatigue management. So that is a very important part because, again, to really reiterate this, is that 3 sets of 8 on a hack squat, you're talking that first set, you're going so hard, you're saying you truly can only hit 2 more reps, which means, honestly, you should have a spotter perhaps on if you're doing like, let's say a V squat or a reverse hack squat.
Help me.
You have to be kind of close to failing. like that has to be a real possibility. And then each set should be meaningful drop downs because you're pushing it that hard. And like I said, I would say very few people do that. Now, obviously on a movement like, let's say, a bicep curl, it's very easy to do just straight sets and keep RPE high, no problem. Going RPE 8 even to failure and just doing 8 to 10 reps and keeping that consistent for 4 straight weeks. So there's actually a really big advantage of static RPE. And this is actually something where I'll probably touch on more on the ascending RPE time of this video. I have seen on the, let's say, Renaissance periodization or Matt Ogus side of things, not to dispute those people or anything like that, but I've seen the recommendations be more like RP 7, 8, 9, and then training to failure as a way to periodize with bodybuilding work. And overall, I'm just not a fan of that idea because, again, we're looking at similarity of stimulus, and when it comes to hypertrophy work, we know 2 things are true. One is periodization is not really associated with any clear benefits, just at all. Periodization as a concept pretty much doesn't have to exist with bodybuilding work. And we actually know this so clearly that there was a study, I believe in 2019, that they randomized exercises every single session while squatting twice a week. So not one squat workout for the entire period of time, nor even within 1 week, was the same. And they got the same benefits roughly as someone with a planned program. So as long as the total amount of hard sets and the RP was high enough, the results were the same. There's only one head of the quads where it wasn't exactly the same. And that makes sense because it probably has to do with proportion of leg extension. Those details start to matter when you really get to the nitty gritty. But again, the point is, when it comes to RPE, that is the primary factor. So if you are dropping down RPE to then ramp it back up, you have to ask yourself, like, why even do that? It would actually be a more similar stimulus to do like 10 rep sets and then do 8 and then end on 6 to 8 rep sets, but keeping out RP 9 the whole way through, than it would to do a 3x8, but then ramp up RPE. That's kind of the most different stimulus because now you're changing the amount of effective reps you're hitting. And ultimately, there are other ways that you can make a progression with bodybuilding work, such as adding sets within a cycle. We've seen some interesting studies on that, where that is an effective way of doing things. Granted, it's kind of a little bit of a riskier thing versus just finding an effective dose and just keeping it there. So I would rather someone manipulate that than manipulate RPE. So overall, I just want to make it clear that I think that's where static RPE is 100% more effective, is on single joint bodybuilding work. But that is compared to rising RPE. We will touch on the changing reps portion where it actually could get interesting on this topic too. And then a second slot I like to see static RPE, and this is very relevant, is when it comes to a lighter slot. And I see this all the time on programs because I would say I've probably looked at more paid and free programs than anybody online. I don't think that's an exaggeration.
Nobody knows this stuff better than me.
Because when doing my research for my own programs and for videos, I really dive deeply and just buy everything and check everything out. Now, one of the errors that I see is that on a slot that should be, let's say, roughly RP6, like you can tell that's the intention. Sometimes people adopt an ascending RPE style because that's kind of the style of the whole cycle. So then they apply that to every single slot, and then maybe that RP6 slot, which is what's ideal within the week, becomes, okay, week 1's RP5, and then maybe RP6 by week 2, maybe RP6.5 by week 3, and then you're ending at RP7 on week 4. Now, the problem with that is the intention of an RP7 3x3, for example, can start to be really different than an RP6. Like it can really start to become a heavy day itself rather than a lighter motor control emphasis day that then leads very naturally into a heavy primary day as a kind of primer. So that's where I like to program static RPE is actually, for example, in the Candido 8-week program, there's a 3x3 slot that's at RP6 on the last set with low hype. And then on week 2, you just run it back with the same load, also with low hype. And then on week 3, now it's back open-ended, 3x3 at RP6 on the last set with low hype. And by then, typically you're able to add around 7.5, 10 kilograms onto your squat without compromising RPE whatsoever. So now you're in that sweet spot the entire time, and you also have not lost momentum, and you've also not increased the amount of fatigue. So then the balance within week is really well maintained. Now, the third type of use case for static RPE is a more unique one, and this is the only one when it comes to primary days where I actually find really interesting and possibly, very possibly optimal, right, for some people. And that is using low RPE training on the primary day and simply maintaining it there. Because one of the weaknesses of ascending RPE is because we're getting such a different stimulus in terms of, let's imagine RP 6, 7, 8, 9, we're getting limited data on how effective RP6 training actually is for that person. When you are holding it at RP6 on your primary day, not just a light day now, then you're able to possibly see like maybe that person's potential increases by simply staying there. And there's actually a really good example of this. There was a coach who posted, he was coaching a smaller female lifter, and he just had her peak on RP6 for her squat singles on the competition squat into a meet. And because her projected 1 rep max was proportionately rising across weeks with this, then they were just able to project the max and then do it and then hit it. And then she was actually able to, I believe, hit a small PR in absolute terms at RP6 and then boom, go into the meet and actually hit a true RP10. As long as your actual strength is increasing, that's a perfectly valid way to train, even if it's an unorthodox peak. So that is something you can only find out by using static RPE and reacting to it. So to recap for static RPE, there are 3 main situations which I recommend it. One is single joint movements. If it's overlapping with the powerlifting movement, I typically program it RP7 last set. If it's not and it's just a pure bodybuilding movement, typically RP9 or so. And then the second use case is that light slot, like I said, that 3x3 with a bi-weekly progression while holding at RP6. And then that third reason is that unique use case on the primary day. Now, I do want to get to some criticisms again of static RPE progressions within a block. And this is probably one of the biggest ones, and it's a very, very tricky one. One of the issues is it's such an effective framework to view training. It's essentially a skepticism of periodization as a concept. That's really the main ethos, you could argue, behind it is, yeah, there are obviously going to have phases throughout the year, and I'm not saying that it's just running the same thing over and over again or anything crazy simple like that. But what it is it's a skepticism that you need to have like higher volume here, lower volume here, and all of that. Instead, you're just reacting to what gets you stronger. One of the weaknesses is that by avoiding a top-down vision a little bit more than these other methods, sometimes you can actually always have something to tinker with to a detriment. And what I mean by that is that there's always something to change, some minor thing to change, and rather than a wholesale big picture change. And that can hold some people back. The prime example of this that I've seen online, and again, this is just from the outside looking in, is Brandon Campbell. I saw Brandon Campbell was being coached in this style 100%.
For the past 4 weeks, I've literally been doing the same thing from week 1 to week 2 to week 3 to week 4. Nothing has changed in terms of the training protocol. Same thing over and over again until you can't recover from it, and then you pivot off of that. And that's where I'm at right now. I'm in a pivot phase, if you will, and I'm going into week 5 of my training. So the first 4 weeks were really identical.
And he did it, and it was kind of like the smarter thing to do on paper, it seemed. And he just had one of the worst meets of his life. I actually think it was probably the worst meet of his life relative to his expectations. And then when he switched to something that did have more of a top-down approach with more variation across these variables into a peak, he actually did really well. And I believe it was on like some cheaper type of app.
Hi, this is week 2 of 4 of the peak week. Just going to show you the top lifts and talk about it a little bit. Day 1, my squat day was not a single, which it's been in previous cycles. Instead, a couple of doubles.
So that's a great example of just because something seems smarter, it's kind of in the evidence-based community, it doesn't mean it's always the superior way, for everyone. Is sometimes just a vision that's top down, just try it, and then it works. And that's something I cannot emphasize enough. Another downside with static RPE, and this is a really nuanced one, but it's very important, is sometimes people respond well to higher RPE training, but just for a very limited exposure. So I mean by this is, especially someone like Ashton Ruska, he's probably a great example, where he's someone where he probably wouldn't peak well if he truly kept just flat RPE at like RP 4 or 5, because he is a guy who does respond to getting really psyched up and hitting something crazy every now and then. However, if he were to have static RPE all the time, well then you go, okay, so we don't go super, super light, but then he definitely can't handle RP 8 to 9 consistently either. He would break down.
What's going to happen if I just lift heavier more often? And, so I experimented with that for a little while. I wanted to see how far I could go before I would basically break, break down literally. And I would measure that, objectively, and I could see how long I could last in certain intensity ranges. And I got a lot of valuable data from that, though.
So there are a lot of people who need exposure to RPE 8 to 9, but for small periods of time, and then they can handle that for a handful of weeks before then falling off the edge of a cliff. Now, I think that's one of the fundamental assumptions with static RPE, and I've seen, for example, Mike Tashir say this, that like singles aren't really fatiguing inherently because it's low volume ultimately, and there's no real evidence to support that higher intensity training is uniquely fatiguing, at least as of now. Central nervous system fatigue, for example, is actually less on singles than it would be on a 20 rep set. So unlike what a lot of people think. However, it's just one of those where you have to go with your intuition and say, it is very clear to me that some people do really get fatigued from high intensity, and I don't think anybody would actually disagree with that. But I think static RP just doesn't have a great answer to the problem that some people do need and benefit from that exposure to heavy lifts just 2 weeks out or 4 weeks out one time. And they can maintain it for that brief period of time, but they can't sustain that for a long period of time, nor would it be beneficial to never hit that until meet day. So for those types of situations, that's where I think ascending RPE just has a really strong case. And I think the real risk is because the only people who do this static RPE style are really smart people. And there's obviously tons of amazing lifters who do it. And because of that, it can kind of become this selection bias. There can be a selection bias in terms of who can handle it. And then if you handle it really well, then, guess what? You're a great example for it. And then if you can't handle it that well, you can always argue, well, you could have done X, Y, Z differently. So that's a little bit more common with a style that's that customizable, is that it's almost like you're only doing it right if you're getting a good result. And then if you're not getting a good result, well, you didn't do it right. Which we've seen kind of with Westside and Louis Simmons, where people always go like, well, you didn't really run Westside. But this time it's actually valid. Like you can actually make the argument that someone can always make fundamental changes and just do it more effectively for each person. So that malleability and the fact that you're coaching yourself, I think overall becomes so much of a problem in terms of being able to manage it long term that I would say for most people coaching themselves, for most slots, other than the isolation movements, I do not recommend this style. Now, that being said, let's get to our second style, which is acclimating to higher RPE throughout the training block.
On to our next topic, rising RPE.